In Demon Slayer, Inosuke Hashibira was one of Tanjiro's friends but was known for having his own unique style of combat, the beast breathing method. Aside from his own implementations of fighting, he was depicted wielding dual katanas, but the most striking aspect of his double swordplay techniques were that his blades were serrated. But the speculative scenario is this: how effective were Inosuke's serrated dual swords? Inosuke mentioned multiple times through the manga and original Japanimation adaptations that due to his upbringing he had his own particular opinions on battle, on what a warrior should do in the said confrontations that they might be in, and even what sort of weapons they should use in those particular situations. Tanjiro and Zenitsu mention that technically Inosuke's style of combat as well as his sword playing isn't practical, and he could only necessarily wage combat due to his own fierce determination as well as his stubborn personality. Inosuke mentioned to Tanjiro that through dialogue his self-created style of beast breathing was something of a trial and error method, as he had applied different ways of fighting, retaining ways, techniques, and implementations that were effective for him personally, and abandoning what he had learned that was no longer effective until he ultimately came up with the attacks, techniques, implementations, and even style that was depicted in the series. Inosuke mentioned that through circumstances he obtained his blades, and essentially said that the dual wielding was something of him thinking that two blades in combat were better when compared to a warrior just wielding a single blade in battle. However, Tanjiro mentioned that just because someone uses more than one of something doesn't mean that particular something is better, but Inosuke refuted Tanjiro's claims, much like his personality, stayed with what he personally considered to be effective for a warrior's way of fighting. But due to the mutual respect that the both of them had for one another, after repeatedly being told by Tanjiro that he needed to hone his techniques in a better way against opponents. In the series, a prime example of Inosuke's swordsmanship came into focus when he was given a new pair of swords. He then proceeded to chip and actually break off parts of the blade with a rock for the serrated look that he had used and knew how to handle previously. Everyone who saw remarked that Inosuke was literally destroying a perfectly good set of swords. Inosuke mentioned that the serrated or chipped way that the blades were in actually suited him better than having the blades in their original and proper condition. It was even hinted at when Inosuke was a child he didn't necessarily have a proper teacher for swordplay. On when the child Inosuke used swords, he actually broke off parts of the blade while using them, and actually became accustomed to the serrated design of them as a result. Tanjiro and Zenitsu mentioned that particular realization was a completely wrong way of using a blade, but Inosuke didn't know any better and probably couldn't ever truly learn the proper way to use a sword. If a person were to actually take a set of swords and attempt to quote-unquote modify them the way Inosuke did, popular consensus were that it would seriously alter the effectiveness of the swords to be used in combat or any sort of confrontational weapon-based situation. The most infamous example of such once again was when Inosuke took a rock to alter the set of swords to his own preferences. The manga and original Japanimation showed the blade being broken to have the serrated depth, but the depth of the chipped blades depicted were to roughly 2.5 centimeters by some estimates. Japanese swords have the strength in the blade, so theoretically with the loss of strength in the bladed area, the lesser back of the blade wouldn't have much for support when being hit or cut against something. There is further harder that if the sword was swiped at something with enough speed, the katana might even have a recoil from the abrupt impact of the sword without the blade to absorb the said impact. The concept of a serrated blade, as Inosuke's dual blades, isn't the only kind of blade to have ever existed. As an example of such a version was the macuahitil, a weapon used by the Aztecs in what is now modern Mexico. But the weapon was specifically designed as such, where the serrated blades in between were smaller, and the way the Aztecs handled the weapons were as clubs or bludgers, not as swords as depicted with Inosuke's case. The Japanese katana were designed specifically to cut and slice. To have a damaged sword like Inosuke's to use in that different way wouldn't necessarily be effective, as the sword could bend or snap at any of the serrated areas of the blade. The macuahitel was also made of wood, but it was still designed to take impacts differently, so there were no problems essentially if it broke during battle, as the warriors who wielded the weapon were prepared for such a result. The effectiveness of Inosuke's swords in actual combat in terms of a real-life example was argued to be neutral at best, due to the circumstances of the sword's conditions when the blade were chipped and how the individual would react to using the serrated blades. Most would agree that the way Inosuke used the weapons as depicted in the manga and original Japanimation could not or would not work in a real-life situation.